Welcome to our special corner. Today, we're going to travel back in time to the Spanish period in the Philippines. We're going to see how storytelling itself was completely changed forever. It's a really cool journey from words that were just spoken to words that were written down. So let's get right into it. But before we dive in, let me ask you something. Just imagine for a second a world with no books, no paper, nothing to write on. How would you share your family stories with your kids or their kids? How would you make sure those important memories stayed alive? Just kind of keep that question in the back of your mind as we go through this. So here's our game plan for today. First, we'll look at the huge shift in how stories were told. Then we'll check out the two main kinds of writing that popped up, religious and secular. And finally, we'll get to meet one of the most famous writers from that whole era. All right, our first stop is this massive transformation going from a spoken tradition to a written one. I mean, this move from just saying words out loud to putting them down on paper was a total game changer for literature in the Philippines. So this whole thing happened in about three main steps. You see, before the Spanish arrived, all literature was oral. Stories, poems, everything was passed down by memory. Then the Spanish show up, and they bring all this new technology with them, paper, printing, a new alphabet. And just like that, writing suddenly had a brand new purpose, to spread the Catholic faith. This new way of doing things led to two, very different paths for writing. On one hand, you had religious writing. Its whole goal was to teach the ideas of Christianity. But on the other hand, you had secular writing, which just means non-religious. That was more about entertaining people, but, still teaching some good moral lessons along the way. Okay, so let's start with religious writing. These were the stories and the poems that were really created to serve the church and its followers. One of the most important pieces of writing from this time is the Pasyon, Pasyon. It's this really long, epic poem that tells the story of Jesus' life, his suffering, and his death. It became so important to the culture that it's actually still sung during Holy Week today. Pretty amazing, right? And besides the Pasyon, there were other important religious books too. You had novenas, which were basically books filled with special prayers. And then there was the Doctrina, which was kind of like a beginner's guide to Catholic teachings. Okay, now let's jump over to the other side of literature from this time, the secular or non-religious writing. These were the stories that were really all about everyday entertainment. A super popular type of secular literature was the Awit. Now, this was a long story poem, but what makes it really special is that it was meant to be sung slowly. You could almost think of it like a modern-day ballad. And a close cousin to the Awit is the Korido. It's also a long story poem, but the big difference is the music. Where the Awit is slow and melodic, the Korido is fast-paced, it's energetic, a totally different vibe. Some other popular secular things were plays and books. The comedia were these plays that often showed battles between Christians and Muslims, where the Christians always came out on top. And then you had books like Urbana at Felisa, which was pretty much a guidebook on good manners for young women. So now that we've kind of explored the different types of stories, let's turn our attention to one of the most important writers of the whole era. And that writer is Francisco Balagtas. This guy was a true giant of Philippine literature. His work really captures the whole spirit of this period. His most famous work, by far, is Florante at Lara. It's a perfect example of that slow, sung poetry, the Awit. But here's the really brilliant part. On the surface, it looks like just a simple love story, but Balagtas was actually using it as this powerful metaphor to criticize all the injustice and bad government he saw around him. So what's the big idea here? What's the main takeaway? Well, the Spanish period was a fundamental turning point for literature in the Philippines. This change from spoken stories to written words was such a huge shift that it's echoed through the centuries and really shaped the stories that are still told today. And that kind of brings us to a final thought. What if this change to writing never happened? How different do you think the stories, the myths, the histories of the Philippines would be today if they had all just stayed spoken? It's pretty fascinating to think about. Thanks for watching. I hope you have learned something.